Hi, my name is Gary Gough, a professional landscape photographer. Coming up in this video, I'm going to share with you how I go about composing my landscape images. So if you're new to landscape photography, or if you're just struggling to compose your landscape images, then this video is definitely for you. Now, I've recently returned from a couple of workshops that I ran in Scotland, the Isle of Skye and Harris and Lewis to be precise. Now, when I'm out and about, I never vlog. It's not fair on the attendees if they see me out and about with my camera. That's not my primary role during a workshop. But what I thought I would do, which I've never done before, is I've just chosen a dozen or so of my favorite landscape images that I captured over the last few weeks, and I thought I would share them with you and talk you through how I went about composing not only these images, but all of my landscape images. Right, let's not mess around. Let's throw ourselves in a PC and get straight down to it. This is image number one. So this was captured on the island of Harris and Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, and it just so happens to be my favorite location on the whole island. And boy, what a fantastic morning we had. So I'll talk you through my composition in a second, but first of all, let me just explain how I went about capturing this particular image. I was perched on a cliff edge on a very, very windy day. Worse still, the wind wasn't blowing from the sea inland, it was blowing from inland out to sea. So being perched on top of a cliff edge just to get this composition the way I've captured it here was no easy feat. It was quite scary. So I was looking at the waves smashing and crashing through here. That was my primary objective, because this area here I thought was the most interesting part of the image. How wrong that proved to be. Just bear with me. So as I'm waiting and the waves are smashing and crashing, the first image I captured, which I thought was quite nice, was when the waves crashed here mid-ground. Next, the waves eventually did crash through these rocks here, and I got super excited about that. But you'll notice on the right-hand side, there's a little trickle of water here. And what I noticed was every now and again, there was a rogue wave that smashed over the rocks here. That is definitely an interesting foreground element. So I waited and waited and waited for another rogue wave. And to my surprise, this happened. A huge rogue wave appeared and crashed all the way over this element of the rock here. And that was just incredible. After that, another one. And I thought this one here was my favorite. Now, if you're fairly proficient at Photoshop, you can combine all those images to create an image that looks like this. And that is the final image. Now, in terms of composition, let's break this down. So in terms of composition, before I break down why this composition works and is very pleasing to the eye, it's important to note that I use rules of thirds an awful lot. Rules of thirds are designed to help you compose your image, but not only compose your image, but if you work to particular rules, they will inadvertently slow your workflow down. If you have a rule where you have to think about where your foreground goes, if you have a rule that makes you think about where your background and midground goes, then it'll help you slow your workflow down. And that's why I love using rules of thirds. There are many other rules, of course, and before we go on further into this video, rules are meant to be broken, and I definitely encourage you to break the rules, but only as long as you know and understand how a good composition in the landscape works. So let me just break this down for you. Let's first of all bring our rules of thirds into play here. And now, as you can see, The horizon is exactly where the horizon should be, which is on that top third. In this particular instance, here I've placed the foreground on the bottom right and the background on the top left. So quite naturally, the viewer is going to be drawn into this scene from the foreground and work their way all the way to the background. Sometimes it can work in reverse. It depends on how powerful the image is. And of course, these rocks here act as a perfect lead-in line. So this is a very natural image for somebody to look at. And on top of that, it's a beautiful image in terms of being well lit, and there's an awful lot going on. So once the viewer has been directed to this area here, which is the foreground, they'll then naturally follow the rocks, which act as a lead-in line to the background interest, and then they'll start perusing around the image. And so that particular image works so well using rules of thirds. Love that image. Love, love, love that image. Now this particular image is a little trickier because it's quite busy and an awful lot going on. But again, let's just bring up my rules of thirds and let's try and dissect this. Foreground interest, the strongest foreground element I thought was this here. The strongest background element was that area up there. So once again, I've got the horizon pretty much where the horizon should be, which is on that rule of thirds there. And I've got the background interest and the foreground interest, again, where they should be. Very rarely does a landscape image work when the foreground and background elements are on the same side. But that does happen from time to time, and indeed I do have an example of that coming up. On this next image, I wanted to just show off this one pinnacle in the sea with all the waves smashing around it, which I loved. And in this particular instance, I opted to place it in the middle. There's a few things I don't like about this image and a few things I do like. First of all, it's a very strong subject and it deserves to be in the middle. The horizon is on the top third and the bottom of the rock is on the bottom third, so it's very well balanced. They're the elements that I do like. The elements that I don't like, things that I try my best to avoid, and that is the land here didn't quite dissipate to nothing. So there are certain times when things are beyond your control. I couldn't really move further to the left or further to the right anyway, because again, I was stood in a rather precarious place. So in this particular instance, I believe I've got the best of the given or my given situation. If you're feeling brave, however, you could remove the land on the right-hand side to minimize that image a little bit more. But I know a lot of people don't like doing it, and I'm not encouraging you to do it if that's not what you like doing. But that's the original image that I took there, and if you want to, again, you could just remove that element. But yeah, that was a tricky one. And this element here is so annoying. So annoying. But I've made the best of that situation. Now this is interesting because we're at the Isle of Skye. This is Neist Point. Some of you guys have probably been here. Now I'm the other side of Neist Point, not the normal side where photographers generally take a picture of the lighthouse. You can see the rest of my workshop crew up here. But what you'll notice here, I mentioned earlier on, it's not good practice to place the foreground interest and the background interest on the same side. But sometimes it works, And sometimes it has to work, like in this instance here. I had no choice. I couldn't move further to the right to bring this foreground interest over here to the left, which I would love to have done, because otherwise this rock here would have hidden the lighthouse. So there are times when the foreground interest and the background interest appears on the same side. And this is one of those times. I do love that image. And that splash of water up there is just incredible. There's a couple more for you. Look at that. What a day. So, again, just coming back from the lighthouse, just using these smashy, crashy waves as foreground interest against the lighthouse in the background. And that's the difference with a sped up shot and a slowed down shutter speed. Interesting. Again, another one there. So you've got a huge wave and a slightly smaller wave. And I think in this particular instance, I honestly believe the smaller wave, which is this one here, works better than the big wave. Beautiful. Love that, love that, love that. So I'm in the same location but further back, but what I've done now is I've used these rocks here as not only foreground interest but a natural frame and leading lines drawing the viewer's eye up to the lighthouse. But again, rules of thirds: foreground interest on the bottom left, background interest on the top right. The horizon is pretty much on the top third, where it sits naturally in this particular instance. From a slightly different angle, now we're using the rocks here again as foreground interest and a frame and leading line, drawing the viewer's eye all the way up to the point of interest. So foreground interest, bottom left, background interest, top right, and lots going on in between. And of course the horizon is pretty much where the horizon should be. Now this was an interesting point because I've not seen any images of the lighthouse from this angle here, and I do like it, and it only really works in portrait orientation. So first of all, the positives: foreground interest bottom right, background interest top left, so that sits really nice, and that horizon pretty much on the third. Now there's one thing I'm not particularly happy about this image, and that is the fact that the horizon cuts through rather awkwardly into the lighthouse. But I couldn't move from where I was. I couldn't get lower, I couldn't get higher. Again, I'm perched right on the edge of a cliff. Not only am I perched on the edge of a cliff, but I'm leaning my tripod and my camera forward to try and capture some of this water down here. Now I love this image. It's a 4-minute exposure captured during the blue hour. There's one thing about this image that I absolutely love, and that is negative space. Lots of photographers don't use or utilize negative space to their advantage. Point I'm making is I photographed the lighthouse from quite low down, so it's not from the normal high perspective that photographers normally shoot Neist point at. I photographed it from quite low down, therefore making the lighthouse stand a bit more proud above the horizon. But then what I opted to do is to place the horizon low down and show 2/3 of pretty much nothing. And I think in this particular instance, it works really well. We've literally just got a clump of information on the bottom left of the frame, but it's the nothingness in this instance that works really well. And I love that particular picture. This is Elgol. Shot this again in the blue hour, well after dark, to be honest with you. Long exposure, no filters, 8-minute exposure, just to get all the movement in the sky to balance up with the ice skating rink effect in the sea. And again, this is another one of those awkward compositions, one of those ones I feel quite uncomfortable taking, but does actually work in the end. And what I mean by that is the foreground interest, which is the water here, sits on the same side as the background interest, which is that main mountain in the Cullens background there, which is beautiful, but still works a treat. I love this lighthouse in the Isle of Harris. It's so cool. Again, in this particular instance, I've opted for a really basic composition. Again, in terms of rules of thirds, we've got top left-hand side, the main element, and the foreground element on the bottom right-hand side. They cross over, they match perfectly. And this was a long exposure at sunset of all things. Even though it's a sunrise location, we went there at sunset, hoping to capture something nice. And to be fair, I think the colors worked really well. From a slightly different angle, love this portrait orientation. Lighthouse top right, these stairs in the middle, and this building here on the left. And so between the 1, 2 and the 3 elements, I think works really well. Now, I'm not a fan of square crops in the landscape, and I'm definitely not a fan of portrait orientation images captured in a landscape. But I do believe, like I've proven here, I hope, that of course there are times when portrait orientation landscape images work really well, and I do like that picture. So just a couple of more images to look at. This was a really minimalistic feel, 5-second exposure just to add a bit of movement and a bit of softness in that water. And what we've got here is foreground interest leading up to the background interest. So again, you can see exactly how I've composed this image. Bottom right, top left, rules of thirds. So let's look at this last image, and this is what the Outer Hebrides is all about, and that is nothingness. But let's break down this composition for a second. I've opted for 2/3 of sky because it's nothing but negative space, and I love the way over an 8-minute exposure, the way the clouds are just moving ever so slightly, but enough to add to the blandness. The water down here, again over an 8-minute exposure, flat calm, all the way up to the sand here. But the horizon is on the bottom third, and the point of interest here, or the break in the water, is right on that bottom right-hand side. So just to recap, I've been a landscape photographer for many years, and I don't just use rules of thirds to teach people about composition. I use them myself. The pictures that I've just shown you are pictures that I didn't create to demonstrate how rules of thirds work. They are genuinely pictures that I took in the field over the past few weeks. And as you can see, even though I've been doing it for a long time, I'm a great believer in very well balanced images, and therefore I'm a great believer in using rules of thirds. And I can't stress this enough: break the goddamn rules as and when it's appropriate to do so. So if you've enjoyed this video and you felt you've got something from it, do me a favor. It's your turn to give me something back in return, just a little bit, and that is help the algorithm by giving that like button a bit of a nudge. And if you're new here and you want to find your way back, then consider subscribing as well. I've got 1 or 2 half-decent videos in my back catalogue. Till the next time, guys, thank you very much indeed for watching. Cheers.